So the genesis of this conversation, I actually didn't know Warren. I didn't know kind of your background in kind of fostering this idea to have a talk on it. But I did have the privilege of meeting with Rochelle, and over coffee, she asked me, she wondered how King Charles's interest in interreligious kind of dialogue and things might affect the Anglican Church. And I will be looking a little bit at how the coronation service included members of other faiths, but I suspect many of you gathered here today might be curious about how I answered Rochelle's question, because it is a great question. Truth be told, I didn't have that much time in our meeting to really answer it. So I think I said something to the effect of, well, it's complicated. So I thought I'd take a brief moment at the beginning of this presentation to address the relationship between the king and us members of the Anglican communion around the world. I would say that there are really two competing popular views of authority, broadly speaking, in the Anglican Church. And the first is that the king is the head of the church. Now, this stems from the fact that Henry VIII, the 16th century English king, wanted to divorce his wife, who was struggling to bear him a male heir. Because England was a Catholic country at that time, Henry sought an annulment from the Pope, but it was not granted. So Henry declared the English Church independent from Rome and named himself the supreme head of the Church of England. Now, this account, in simple terms, glosses over many of the details of the complex relationships between monarchs and the heads of churches during the Reformation era, whether we're talking about the Pope or any other religious authority, depending on the area. In Protestant lands, for example, religious leaders such as Martin Luther or John Calvin held sway with the ruling monarch, and the same held true with Orthodox bishops in the East. But religious authorities during that time only held power to the degree to which it was granted to them by other secular authorities, for it is ultimately the one who controls the military who has the final say. So Henry wasn't really acting that far out of character for a monarch of the time. Rulers throughout the world at that time would exert their authority in religious matters to the degree that their interests warranted it. Thankfully, this is no longer the case in England. And thankfully, no monarch after Henry VIII has been named the head of the Church of England. Subsequent monarchs have only been named governor of the church. I won't get into the theological reasons for that or how that nuance differs, but everyone after Henry VIII has been named the governor of the church. So things have evolved greatly over time, and the role of King Charles in the Church of England is similar to his role as a monarch more generally. It's now, I would say, more of a ceremonial role. The second popular view of authority in the Anglican Church is that because we retained an episcopal structure, meaning that we have bishops each overseeing a kind of territory, and then archbishops overseeing multiple bishops, that the main change in the English Reformation was to replace the Pope, who was way down in Rome, with a kind of local Pope in the form of the Archbishop of Canterbury. However, the Archbishop of Canterbury was never vested with that kind of religious authority, as was the Roman Pope. In fact, if you read the 39 Articles of Religion, one of the founding documents of Anglicanism, it's clear that one of the correctives that the English reformers were trying to make was to return to a more ancient practice of there being equal authority between bishops. The Archbishop of Canterbury is therefore considered first among equals. He doesn't have an authoritarian type of role in the Church of England that would be comparable to the Pope's role in the Roman Catholic Church. So despite the perception that either the monarch or the Archbishop of Canterbury are the ones really in charge of the Church of England, the reality is that the bishops are in charge, and the matter got even more complicated as a result of colonialism. And I'd love to talk a little bit more with Amy about colonialism and post-colonialism. It's a passion of mine, but I won't get too deep into that today. But during the colonial era, of course, Anglican missionaries went out to the English colonies and they set up Church of England churches in different parts of the world. And the Anglican Church in each of those locations gradually took on a distinctly local flavor And eventually they each grew and matured to the point where they declared their independence and formed independent national bodies. Often this happened at the same time as the nation as a whole declared independence from England. And that is why we have the Anglican Church of Canada, the Anglican Church of Kenya, the Anglican Church of New Zealand, and so on and so forth. Some of them are even called the Episcopal Church instead of Anglican, and that's because the Anglican Church in different places wanted to distance itself from England for political reasons. Episcopal just refers to the structure of having bishops. And so we have the Scottish Episcopal Church, the Episcopal Church USA, the Episcopal Church of South Sudan, and so on. So that's a bit of a long-winded historical introduction, but I hope that it helps to illustrate the limits to what influence the King and the Archbishop of Canterbury and the Church of England itself might have upon our Anglican practices here in Canada. These people and institutions have the authority to informally inspire us, but they have no formal authority over us in the Anglican Church of Canada. Our Anglican Church of Canada relationship with the communion as a whole is one more of opting in. I prefer to think of it as a relationship based more on the carrot than the stick. So with that in mind, let's talk about the coronation. And let's see what kind of carrots it might offer for us here today. How might the coronation service inspire our activities as part of the CCCJ? I heard someone address this group as the Calgary Council of Christian and Jews. So I named this talk Interfaith Symbolism in the Coronation of King Charles III, Virtuous or Merely Virtue Signaling. So I chose this somewhat provocative title, not just to generate interest, but to also critically consider the role of interfaith symbolism in actually building unity between religions. Because not all symbolism actually achieves something. Sometimes symbols can fail to connect with people. And when that happens, those symbols fail to carry any meaning for them, kind of like the speed limit signs on Stony Trail, meaningless, largely. So let's take a look at the coronation service and consider whether that interfaith symbolism that it held should be lauded as virtuous, meaning that it will actually help to foster interfaith harmony, or if it might instead be just considered a kind of virtue signaling that does little more than to help the institution of the monarchy and the king to appear politically correct. Now, some of you haven't watched the coronation service. It can be found on the royal family's YouTube channel, and the service order can be found on their website, royal.uk. So to begin, the ritual of coronation is really a series of ancient rituals which have their roots in the 9th century and which are integrated into a Christian Eucharistic services. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the Eucharist is a Christian ritual of consecrating, so praying over and then consuming bread and wine that is considered by the faithful to be the body and blood of the resurrected Christ. So this is a ritual which is shared by Christians of many denominations in one form or another. And the overall structure of the coronation service was therefore pretty comparable to Eucharistic services common to most Anglican churches. It was actually quite similar to what we do at the Cathedral, Church of the Redeemer, every Sunday. Bible passages were read, a short sermon was preached, hymns were sung, and bread and wine were prayed over and received. But if we compare the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in 1953, who was it that was watched that? Yeah, to the coronation of King Charles III in 2023, we will see a number of significant differences involving representatives of different faith traditions. And that's what I want to focus on in our presentation today. So we saw in the procession at the beginning of the service, when everybody walked up, that representatives from all of the major world religions join in that procession. These members of the faith community were actually at the very front of the procession. I think actually when I look back at the recording, I think they might have missed recording that very well, but they were right at the front. There was Wendy Cunningham, Director and Trustee of the National Spiritual Assembly of the Baha'is of the United Kingdom. forgive me if I butcher anybody's name, but Mehul Sangrajka from the Institute of Jainology, Malcolm Debu, president of the Zoroastrian Trust Funds of Europe, Bagoda Silawamala, head monk of the London Buddhist Vihara, Lord Singh, director of the network of Sikh organizations in the UK, Visakha Dasi, president of Bhaktivedanta Manor, which is a Hare Krishna temple, Alaya Azam from the Al-Khoi Foundation, which is part of the Shia Muslim community, Hamid Patel from Star Academies, part of the Sunni Muslim community. And then there was Ephraim Mervis, chief rabbi, did I say that right? Ephraim Mervis, chief rabbi of Great Britain and the United Hebrew Congregations of the Commonwealth. So by having these revered leaders of the major world religions at the beginning of the procession, I would say that there were two effects. There was one positive and one negative. The positive was that by entering first, of course, they hold a place of primacy. So they are the first to be given attention by the crowd, and by doing so, a certain place of respect. But the negative was that in Anglican Church processions, the most revered members of the liturgical party usually enter at or near the end. So in this case, the king and his entourage were at the end, and the Archbishop of Canterbury and his entourage were second to last, with many others processing between them and the other faith leaders. So in this respect, placing the representatives at the beginning was a way to kind of appease both the general public that would have liked that primacy probably, as well as the more rigid traditionalists that maybe wanted to keep, the Christian and the king stuff at the back. So having representatives of these traditions, even a part of the procession, I think would have been a stretch for many traditionalists. So I think the benefits of the symbolism of having them present and featured prominently at the beginning would have borne more weight in the public's mind than the symbolism of them not being featured at the end, an aspect that was probably only picked up on by church geeks like me. So overall, I would deem it to have been a virtuous choice, although not without controversy. Once everyone had processed in, the faith leaders were then welcomed. They welcomed the king, saying in unison, "Your Majesty, as neighbors in the faith, we acknowledge the value of public service. We unite with people of all faiths and beliefs in thanksgiving and in service with you for the common good." So all of those faith leaders said that right at the beginning as the procession came up. And so in this context, having the faith leaders speak first, I think was a further plus. It reaffirmed the respect which would have been communicated publicly by having them at the front of the procession. And I think it gave a kind of rationale to it almost, in that they needed to be first in order to be there first to welcome him. And as the first were then brought to meet the last, it kind of almost disrupted that hierarchical nature of the procession. Maybe not totally, but it kind of circled the line, if you will. So after some more music, the Archbishop of Canterbury then introduced the service. King Charles then turned to each of the 4 points of the compass and was recognized by representatives of peoples from all directions as their, quote, undoubted king. And then a Bible was presented to the king. It was presented by Ian Greenshields, moderator of the Church of Scotland, also known as the Scottish Presbyterian Church. And the importance, I think, of this act should be noted. So the Bible was the first item to be given to the king, and this upheld the Christian tradition established in the rite and reassured the establishment of the primacy of the Christian faith and their ongoing life together. But now, in order not to be too put off by the symbolism as a member of a different faith, I'd like to just remind you of how divided the United Kingdom has been since the Protestant Reformation over issues of national denominational identity. England has for many centuries charted a kind of middle path between Catholicism and Protestantism in its Anglican expression of Christianity. Ireland has been largely Catholic, Scotland, Presbyterian, and Wales, since at least the 1800s, has been decidedly nonconformist, meaning that Protestant groups other than the Anglican and Presbyterian, such as Methodist, Baptist, and Congregational, have been in the majority. So by having the moderator of the Church of Scotland present the Christian scriptures as the first item, and then calling for the king to swear on the Bible to govern his peoples in their various territories, quote, according to their respective laws and customs, there was not only a moral imperative in that commitment, but also a kind of solemnization by swearing upon that uniting symbol of the Christian scriptures. Well, uniting for the Christians at least. Mm-hmm. Those who were and still are most prone to fostering division in the United Kingdom. So the king then promised to retain the establishment of the Anglican Church, and he declared his own Protestant faith, both acts of which have been required of the English monarch since the Act of Settlement, which passed in 1701. That act solidified the UK's national denominational identity as Protestant, despite the presence of a strong Catholic population, for the purposes of ensuring a parliamentarian and democratic form of government. Now, whether Protestantism and parliamentary democracy necessarily go hand in hand is outside the scope of this presentation, but for the purposes of understanding this part of the coronation rite, that seems to have been the English experience. Now, following that part of the service was probably the most significant moment in the coronation for our concerns today, at least I would say so. For the first time ever at a British coronation, the king prayed publicly for the grace to be a blessing to all of every faith and belief. That was quite the innovation, because historically, King James IV of Scotland was the first to be proclaimed protector and defender of the Christian faith by Pope Julius II in 1507. Ever since then, British monarchs have taken that title, defender of the faith, meaning the Christian faith. Twice in the coronation service, we did see the Archbishop of Canterbury address Charles as defender of the faith, first in his oath of loyalty, and then again during the Eucharistic prayers. But here, when Charles himself speaks, he prays to be a blessing to all, regardless of faith or belief. Now, I, maybe unlike some of you, have no insider knowledge from where this innovation arose, if it was a decision by Charles personally or from the Archbishop of Canterbury or any of their advisors. After all, one could imagine that this was the more politically correct thing to say, but it is consistent with what we know of Charles's long-standing sensitivity to interfaith issues. King Charles has always shown an interest in other religions and has often actively promoted interfaith dialogue. In fact, way back in '94, he expressed to a member of the press that he might prefer to be considered defender of faith, generally speaking, rather than defender of the faith, meaning the Christian faith. In 2015, when it seemed apparent that he might actually outlive his mother and be crowned king, he did clarify that he aligned with Queen Elizabeth's views that the church has a duty to protect the free practice of all faiths in that country. So our Anglican belief in that prior God-given freedom of choice is therefore fundamental to the role of the king in safeguarding freedom of religion in the UK. Therefore, from an Anglican perspective, the defender of the Christian faith needs to also be the defender of faith, more broadly conceived. Charles' visits to other countries through the years have often included meetings with local religious leaders, regardless of whether they were Christian or not. Charles has also used his charity, the Prince's Trust, to encourage interfaith dialogue amongst young people. So it would at least seem on the surface that this innovation in the coronation ritual could be attributed to the influence of Charles's personal opinion and sentiment, although there is no denying that his subjects, the majority of whom are not practicing Christians, would have also been in favor. My personal opinion is that Charles praying for grace to be a blessing to all of every faith and belief was really the least that could be done in this day and age. Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, then read a passage of scripture from the book of Colossians speaking about the role of Christ in God's human salvation. Now, the fact that Mr. Sunak is a practicing Hindu sparked a whole lot of controversy, and there are legitimate questions to be raised in this with regards to cultural appropriation, whether it shows adequate respect to what is actually being said, to have someone who in explicit ways has made known that they don't believe it. The official response from Lambeth Palace, which is the office of the Archbishop of Canterbury, said that Mr. Sunak's personal faith was not an issue during the service, since he was participating in his capacity as Prime Minister. They said that his reading from the Bible emphasized his role in representing the nation and its people. It was also known to be in line with his many well-intentioned gestures to foster interreligious harmony. In my mind, however, that question of cultural appropriation still stands. They could have had him involved in a different role that wouldn't have been received as disrespectful to many. So maybe this gesture was more virtue signaling than virtuous. But moving on. Next, various items of regalia were presented to the king, each said to be a visible reminder of his great responsibility under God. There were spurs and armils, which would have been worn by a medieval knight, a sword which the king first wears and then offers in the service of God. And then came the symbols of secular and spiritual power, an orb representing the world under Christ, a scepter with cross representing earthly power, held in a restrained, gloved hand, and the scepter with a dove representing spiritual authority exercised chiefly in mercy. There was also a ring symbolizing the faithful marriage of the monarch to his peoples. Those presenting the regalia to the king reflected the diversity of the United Kingdom and its peoples, in striking contrast to the last coronation. However, the religious faiths of those presenting were not made known, because at least in my mind, it wouldn't have been appropriate for that ritual. So I guess that means a point in the virtuous column. Then the Archbishop placed St. Edward's crown on the king's anointed head, and all cried, "God save the king." While the fanfare was sounded, the abbey bells were rung, and gun salutes were fired, and the king was enthroned. Once enthroned, the king received homage, meaning a promise of allegiance and faithfulness, recognizing his spiritual and earthly authority, first from the Archbishop of Canterbury, and then from His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, and then from others. That the Queen was anointed and crowned and presented with her own items, the liturgy of the sacrament with the giving of Holy Communion to just the King and the Queen followed, and that was the remainder of the service, followed by the procession out. So overall, I do think that many good choices were made in the service to foster interreligious harmony. They included the leaders of the UK faith communities. They were the first to welcome the king, having the king pray to be a blessing to people of all faiths, upholding the parliamentary form of government, which safeguards diversity, at least to some degree, and having many visible minorities feature prominently in the service in various roles sets a context for inclusion and safety despite difference. All of these choices, I think, set an implicit and explicit context for those of other religions, with only the choice of having a Hindu read the Christian scripture potentially being a negative one in my mind. But that's what I think. What do you think? I would love to hear, if anyone has any questions for me, I would love to hear just what you thought yourself.
Question.